Welcome, everyone, to this week's broadcast of Ascend TV live on the Autism Spectrum. I'm your co host, Keith Halperin,
And I'm Will Burnick.
and today our topic and guests is Autism and Managing Criticism with our guest, Dr. Diana Partovi. Before we get into that, though, what are you wearing now?
Funny you should ask that. I'm wearing my USF shirts. I encourage all the former USF students or just USF sports fans.
Thank you, Will. I appreciate that, as do all our USF fans here in San Francisco and beyond. Would you like to begin with our guest?
Tell us about your background and how you came to work with the autism community.
All right. Yes, I'm happy to answer that question, Will. So I am what's called a clinical neuropsychologist. So that means I got a doctoral degree in psychology, and then I specialized in kind of brain behavior. So the way a person's brain is kind of wired, how it might impact their behavior. And for about 12 years, I worked in the VA system. So I worked with veterans, and I did a lot of assessment for things like memory, maybe after a veteran had a traumatic brain injury. I did a lot of assessment for folks who were starting to have memory difficulties. And then I started doing a lot of assessment with people who were neurodivergent. So I started looking at attention deficit disorder and even autism. And that's how I got very interested in this field.
Tell us about your current practice with the autism community.
Yeah, so about 3.5 years ago, I started my own private practice called California Neuropsychology Services. And a big part of the reason I wanted to do that is I started seeing a lot of people who had, diagnosis of autism or maybe ADHD who were struggling at work, really struggling to be supported by their managers or even to kind of feel like they fit in with other employees. So now in my current private practice, I do a lot of presentations, about 125 to 150 a year, to employers where I go in and I talk about how important it is to have neurodivergent folks in your workplace, how important it is to value them and to support them. And then I also do a lot of evaluations for adults who are or think they may be autistic or have things like attention deficit disorder or learning disorders. That's what I do now.
Thank you, Will and Diana. I understand that one of your main areas deals with criticism, managing it, accepting it, providing it in a positive way. Can you let our viewers know a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I got really interested in is how criticism can be maybe more difficult for autistic individuals for a number of different reasons. And that could include things like history of being teased or bullied. So, already being more sensitive and having received maybe more criticism than others. It could include the fact that autistic folks often have more like their nervous system is a little bit more sensitive or maybe a lot more sensitive. So we even see things like rejection sensitive dysphoria, where a lot of autistic people will say, that criticism wasn't just hard for me to hear, it actually felt painful. I really, really struggle with that criticism. And then sometimes we see that those thoughts about the criticism, a person might think about it over and over and over again. And then we also know for a lot of autistic folks, language can be different. So when they're receiving criticism, maybe it takes a longer time to sort of process that information, or to kind of think about what that person wants to say back. And so for all those reasons, criticism can be kind of difficult, but there are some really helpful strategies to be able to manage that criticism when it does happen.
What are some of those strategies that you recommend?
Yeah. So one of the first things, and especially because that nervous system can be a little bit more activated, is kind of the first thing I like to tell people to do is pause and reflect. So we can be just very reactive. And this is most of us, when we receive criticism, we want to kind of respond or maybe even lash out, because it's hard to receive criticism, or we may shut down. But instead of doing either of those things, we might want to just say, okay, I'm going to take a deep breath and check in with myself. What do I need in this moment? Do I need to actually calm myself down? And if that's the case, how can I do that best? So actually, when I was talking about this last week, um, I asked the audience, what kinds of things do calm you down? What types of things help you regulate your nervous system? And people said everything from weighted blankets or weighted stuffed animals to maybe walking or pacing, having their pets nearby might be helpful. Even doing some like deep breathing. There's something we call box breathing where you take a deep breath in for a count of 4, hold it for a count of 4, and then exhale for a count of 4. So really starting with just pausing and scanning your body and kind of what do I need in the moment. And then I talked about linking your actions next to kind of what's most important to you. So I talked about values. And values are those things that bring your life meaning and purpose and joy, hopefully. So, for example, if you're getting criticism from an employer, but you really value having that job, you value having that income or that place that you get to go a few times a week or several times a week, maybe in that moment, instead of lashing out and saying you're wrong, you want to think about, this job is really important to me. Maybe I need to actually step back and listen to what this person is saying. So before making a decision, thinking about, is this thing I'm going to do when I receive the criticism, is it going to bring me closer to my values? So that was another thing I talked about. And then we talked about just how to respond to criticism. And there's a couple different, lots of different ways we could do it, but one could be to actually get curious and ask a few more questions. Okay, well, you're saying that my voice is too loud, or you're saying that I didn't notice when somebody was upset. Can you tell me more about that? How do you have ideas on what I need to do differently next time, for example? So getting curious could be one thing. Maybe realizing that there could be something constructive in the criticism, and trying to pick out what part of that criticism is something you actually have control over, maybe you could change or do differently. um, I think thanking the person if they're giving you feedback that is constructive and helpful can also be really nice. But then knowing when maybe that criticism wasn't very nice and it's not very helpful, and I actually need to set some boundaries. So we talked about a framework for setting boundaries called the Dear Man. And would it be helpful for me to go over just an example of that?
Very much so. Please do.
Okay. Okay. So the example that I used is maybe when a parent or a caregiver or a loved one gives you criticism in front of other people. And the Dear Man strategy, it stands for, the D stands for describe the situation. The E stands for express, like how it makes you feel. The A stands for assert, what do you want from that person? And the R stands for reinforce, what do you, or what did they get in return? So I'll go over that first. And then the man stands for kind of how to do it. So if in this situation, describe might be, you know what, mom, when you tell me that I did something you thought was, rude, or you didn't like the way I did this, in front of you, or you told people this in front of other people. So I'm just kind of describing the situation. You gave me feedback in front of other people. Then the E, that's the describe. Then the E for express is using kind of I statements. When that happened, I felt really embarrassed, and I also shut down. I couldn't even really process what you were saying. The A for assert would be what you want. So here I might say, next time you have feedback for me or even criticism for me, can you make sure that you tell me that in private? And maybe you would even say here, and I'd actually rather you don't do it right after I've had a busy day at work because my head's already full. I'm already overstimulated. I'm not going to be able to maybe be patient with you at that time of the day. And then the R is for reinforce. So what do they get in return? When you give me that feedback in private, maybe more on a Saturday morning when I'm not too tired, then I'm going to be able to hear you better, and I'll be able to respond to you more patiently, and more kindly, for example. And then the man kind of stands for how we do it. So it's mindful. M is for mindful. And that means just staying focused on the goal. You might try to give somebody feedback or set boundaries, and they might try to ask you all kinds of different questions, but you might just come back to, you know what, I just really want to talk about how I'd like to receive feedback in the future. A is for appearing confident. This one's harder to do, but it just kind of means not apologizing if you're setting some boundaries. If you're letting somebody know what you need, don't apologize. You deserve to set a boundary. And then N is for negotiate if necessary. And so this might be maybe a parent or loved one coming back and saying, well, maybe this can't wait until Saturday because it happened on Monday. And then you might say, okay, well, can you at least tell me I have some feedback to give you? Can I give you 30 minutes to kind of collect your thoughts? And then we'll have that conversation. So you're negotiating a little bit, but you're not giving up everything.
These sound like very, very viable strategies. At the same time, I can imagine just hearing them doesn't mean you'll be able to immediately do them. Typically, with your clients, how long, and I would expect it would vary a great deal, would it take for someone to practice these areas and get them to so that they're second nature to them?
Yeah, so sometimes we'll actually do role plays in a session. A client and I might do this together, and we'll use real life examples because I think those are easier for a person to kind of put themselves in that situation. And maybe that takes several different trials. And then I'll usually ask them to go practice with somebody who's kind of lower risk. So, for example, if you really need to talk to your boss or you need to manage criticism from your boss, I might say, start with your friend first. Maybe start by practicing how you're going to set boundaries with a friend. Or maybe start, with a parent, that you feel like you have a good relationship with, that, maybe there's one parent that is a little bit harder to set boundaries with than another parent. So maybe starting with the parent that you feel a little bit more comfortable with, or even telling them ahead of time, I'm working on setting some boundaries, or I'm working on how I manage criticism. Can you remind me of some of the strategies that I'm working on if I forget? I think that can be helpful too.
One additional thing, and then we'll turn it back over to Will, is that someone who fully admits has a very thin skin regarding criticism, I often immediately react to either, defense or anger when I receive criticism. It's like that. So, and you'd mentioned about being able to slow things down. Do you have any strategies about how to avoid the sort of the fight or flight response when someone has criticism?
Yeah, so I think a lot of those grounding techniques that we talked about last week are important. So the box breathing might be one of them, just to
Mhm.
kind of bring yourself, we know that fight or flight, what happens to us is our heart starts to race. Other things happen too, like our stomach might start to hurt, our palms might sweat. You can't really make your stomach stop hurting and you can't make your palms stop sweating, but you can bring down your heart rate. So that could be doing something like the box breathing for a lot of my clients, and for me too. In fact, I have on my desk at all times, I have like fidget items or stim items. So I have a putty that sometimes I will use to just kind of ground myself. There is another technique called the 5-4-3-2-1 technique, where we're engaging our senses. So in the moment, instead of kind of flying off the handle, you might look and see what are 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, or 1 thing you can taste. And for autistic folks who have more sensory sensitivities, you might skip. Like for me, smells really hard, so I might skip the smell thing unless there's good smells in the area. But it's really bringing yourself back kind of to your body, because often our brains just go down these thoughts of like worst case scenario. This person thinks I'm terrible. This person thinks I'm stupid. This person hates me. This is what happens to our brain when we go into fight or flight. So it's bringing your brain back from that brink and centering yourself back in your body until you can calm down enough to decide what you actually want to say, or if you want to say anything at all. In some cases, maybe that person's criticism is just rude and mean, and you don't need to respond to it.
Thank you again, Dinah. Those were excellent points. I understand now that Stacey Kennedy, our cultural correspondent, has a couple of questions for our guest.
Yeah. Hi, Diana. I guess my question, how I will put it, how does one handle their entitlement?
Are you talking about like if you just want to fawn and maybe not say anything and just kind of not stand up for yourself a little bit?
Well, yeah, but also think about what to actually say. Like I don't want to stop there. Yeah.
Yeah.
I may fawn at first, for sure. But
Yeah.
now, how do I talk up for myself?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that fawning response is so important because for a lot of autistic folks who have a more sensitive nervous system, one of the things I hear from my clients a lot is I feel other people's pain. So if somebody else is angry, I feel angry. If somebody else is sad, I feel sad. And so that fawning sometimes comes up because it's hard to feel another person's pain. We don't want another person to be angry at us. So that fawning, I think, reaction is sometimes a protective mechanism. I'm just going to try to smooth the wrinkles. I'm going to try to make sure everything's okay so that I don't have to feel upset because someone else is feeling upset. So I think knowing that and then saying, okay, but in this situation, this person's anger, it's not my anger. I don't have to own it. I don't have to take responsibility for it. So it's okay for me to say, you know what, I don't like that you said that to me, or I don't like that you said it that way to me. Sometimes one of the ways that helps me to stand up for myself is to think about what would I want someone I care about to do in that situation. If somebody's giving them feedback that's not helpful or it's mean-spirited, it might be hard for me to speak up for myself, but if I think about my daughter, for example, I would want her to be able to speak up for herself. So I might remind myself, you know what? If I stand up for myself and I speak up, I'm also showing other autistic individuals or I'm showing other people they're worth it also. And so two things. I don't have to own that person's emotions. They own their own emotions. I don't have to, help them not feel as upset. That's not my job. And also, if I can stand up for myself, maybe I also give other people permission to stand up for themselves.
We'll now have a question from our producer, Matthew McIntyre.
If there's someone who is self-critical of themselves and they can't handle their own criticism, how can they handle self-criticism or self-deprecation?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think it's something that many of us struggle with, self-criticism. And I think the first thing to notice is that it's actually happening. And to kind of get clear about your thoughts. What thoughts are you having when you're self-critical? And many of those thoughts are things I mentioned kind of a few minutes ago. So it might be, I'm messing up, or other people hate me, or I'm a failure, or I'm never going to be able to do this well. And those thoughts, when we're really upset, when we're being really self-critical, are usually pretty black or white. Everybody hates me. Nobody will ever understand. So kind of thoughts that have everybody, nobody, always, never. And again, those are thoughts that are very normal for us to have when we're feeling distressed. But we don't want those thoughts to actually control us. So there are a couple of different ways we can notice those thoughts and then strip them of their power, so that they don't kind of, like a big wave that comes and washes us out to sea. We don't want our emotions to have that kind of power over us. So one way is just to notice that you're having the thought and to recognize that even though we often think our thoughts are 100% true, they are not, especially when they're those kind of very extreme all or nothing thoughts. So if we can just step back a little bit, give ourselves a little distance from that thought and just recognize, oh, you know what? That thought just popped into my head. Doesn't mean it's true, but I am having that thought. That can sometimes help the emotion because our thoughts have a huge impact on our emotions. That can often help the emotions kind of decrease in intensity. There's a couple other things you can do. One of my favorites is recognizing, oh, I'm having that same old thought again. And that is just an indication to us that we're having these thoughts that we're not good enough because it's a habit. We've had it so many times, it's now become a habit. We're not having the thought because it's true. We're having the thought because it's a habit. And when we think about it that way, we can recognize there are lots of times where we've had situations where people said they did like us. They do appreciate us. We are doing a good job. So that, that thought, that habit, we also have lots of evidence against that thought when we actually think about how often maybe it's popped into our head. I think the other option is then to think about an alternative thought. We can't necessarily erase that original self-criticism that pops into our head. We don't really have control over the thoughts that pop into our head. So you may still have that thought pop into your head, but you can kind of use that again, that pause and reflect button. You can say, ooh, I'm having that thought. It's not necessarily true. I've had it before. I have lots of evidence against it. I'm actually going to come up with an alternative thought that's a little bit more balanced and a little bit more helpful. So maybe that alternative thought would be, I do need to work on this area where I'm really trying to improve, but I've actually made a lot of progress, and several people have told me they appreciate the work I'm doing.
Thank you again, Will and Diana. As a final question, Diana, you have discussed a lot about how those receiving criticisms could more constructively react to them. Do you have any strategies about how we might be most able to effectively give criticism to others?
Yeah, and I think we could go back to that dear man, framework that I talked about. That would be one way. So describing what the situation is, expressing how it makes you feel, asserting what you want that person to do, and then reminding them of why this is going to be good for everybody. And we used an example of kind of, maybe you want to give somebody feedback about how they provide feedback to you. But I also think a few other things to think about would be, for a lot of people, it's helpful to sit down and either write out what they want to say ahead of time, or for some folks, and a lot of folks I work with, writing is difficult, typing is difficult. So I often will recommend just open a Word document, hit that dictate button, and then talk your way through what you want to say so that you can get clear about your main points. What is it you actually want to say to the person if you're providing them with criticism, or I would say probably call it feedback? Um, that can be helpful. So writing it out can help you kind of clarify in your own mind what it is you want to say and kind of why you're saying it, and also what you hope to get out of that feedback. What do you want from the other person? Another way I would think about it is, how would you want to receive that feedback? So if you know that you like to receive feedback in writing, or you want somebody to ask you, do you prefer it in writing or do you prefer we have a talk about it? Maybe you provide that option to the other person. Maybe you give them a heads up or a warning. Hey, I have some feedback I'd like to share with you. When would you like me to share that with you? How would you like me to share that with you? And then I think what's so important too is that a lot of people need time to think about and digest feedback. So if you're giving feedback to somebody, it's really important to say, I realize you may not have an answer for me right now. I want to give you enough time to think about it, and then let me know when you want to talk through it again, or when you want to come back to this topic. I think those are really important. It's the same kinds of things most of us would want if we're receiving feedback. And then I think the last thing would just be to keep it kind. There's a graceful way to give feedback and a not very graceful way to give feedback, or a kind way and not very kind way. So again, how would you want someone to tell you something that might be even difficult feedback? What would be the nicest way they could do it? Then try to do that to the person you're giving feedback to.
Those viewers who would be interested in learning more about your services, or contacting you directly for them, what's the best way for them to do so?
So probably the easiest way would be to go to my website, which is Cal for California, CAL, neuropsych.com. And for anybody who wanted to work with me individually, there's a free consultation button you can click on, and you can sign up for a 15-minute free consultation.
We'll now turn over to our cultural correspondent, Stacey Kennedy, for the Cultural Report.
Hello, everybody, and very first thing I'd like to share is on Saturday, December 7th, is Ascend's 25th anniversary celebration, which will be taking place at the Arc of San Francisco, starting at noon, going until 3 p.m. And for more details and for the invitation, contact info@ascend.org. Sunday, next thing, Sunday, December 8th, the Autism Society Bay Area is having a holiday jazzmatazz. I think that's how they say it. And also a sing-along. This will be happening, sounds like more in the South Bay in Campbell. They'll be at the Recital Hall at 2:30 p.m. and a visit from Santa himself. This event is free. Oh, and just to let you know, the last event I mentioned is free as well. Registration for this one, going back to the Jazzataz, registration is recommended but not required. 5 tickets per family. Parking is free. And Jill Escher, you can email her or call her for more information on that. And the last thing I would like to bring up is Saturday, December 21st, Quirky Christmas, presented by the Square Peg Foundation, an inclusive holiday party celebration, an event designed for the autistic and neurodiverse family and individuals, offering a joyful, inclusive, sensory-friendly experience for all. To put your family, no, excuse me, I read something wrong. Anyways, you can wear your pajamas. There's going to be a pajama parade. So there's also going to be treat yourself to a delicious snack and lots of other things. This will be happening in the Half Moon Bay, California at 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And the Autism Societal Jill Escher, you can phone her and email her on that, more information on that too. Thank you so much.
We'll now hear from Jennifer Brooks with our book review.
Today, I would like to tell you about the book Camouflage: The Hidden Lives of Autistic Women, written by Dr. Sarah Bargiella and with artwork by Sophie Standing. This book is different from most other books in that it's written as a comic book. The main story is about a woman named Amy. She's a journalist who was diagnosed with autism at age 20. Before getting a diagnosis, Amy spent a lot of time researching autism online. After her diagnosis, she decided to set up a forum for other autistic women, a place to ask questions, understand autism, and socialize. And so then the book discusses the early history of the scientific research in autism with Kanner and Asperger, and then goes on to discuss the gender gap in autism diagnoses and the possible reasons for it. Then it talks about what the DSM describes as the, quote, typical symptoms of autism, which often appear differently between men and women. In women, they're often not as intense, therefore easier to mask or hide. And then she goes on to discuss 4 headlines. The first headline is people saying, "You're not autistic. You can't be autistic because you're just shy," or "You're not good enough at math to be autistic," or "You're not autistic, you're just anxious or depressed or kooky or weird or strange or eccentric or whatever." People, please, let's make a commitment not to do that anymore. Second headline is "Pretending to be Normal." There is a book with that title, which I hope to feature in a future episode. Third headline is "From Passive to Assertive." Yes, this is something I personally struggle with. I tend to lead too much on the passive end until I get pushed beyond a certain breaking point, and I become angry and aggressive. Fourth headline is "A Social Identity Based on Interests." This is something Temple Grandin often emphasizes, building relationships based on common interests, which could be something as simple as, we both like the Gladiator movie. We're both interested in ancient Rome, and interest doesn't necessarily need to be a hobby. So yes, those are 4 common themes that often appear in the lives of both autistic men and autistic women.
I'm Keith Halperin.
I'm Will Burnick.
Stacey Kennedy.
Matthew McIntyre.
Diana Partovi.
And until next time, we're AASCENDTV live on the Autism Spectrum.